Thank you for attending today. And Leigh, you can unmute your microphone and begin your presentation.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. Do I sound okay?
Yes, coming in loud and clear.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks everybody for hanging in there amongst the tech difficulties. I'm going to confess that actually they worked in my favor because I accidentally recorded this webinar onto my own calendar at the wrong time. And so one of the big panics of this morning was discovering I had done that. So I'm so glad for the strange confluence of things that happened this morning. So I published a document yesterday on the Don't Move Firewood website that is called, there we go, the Firewood Comparison Report. And what it is a first ever complete look at every single state and U.S. territory, U.S. state and U.S. territory firewood relevant regulation, certification, and outreach status across various agencies and entities comprehensively for the entire United States. We intentionally did not focus on federal regulations. These are state and territorial regulations and rules. The only time that we closely incorporated federal regulations and situations is when they pertained in particular to a given state. So I know that's a subtlety, but we're going to start off this presentation as a whole by making sure that we're all on the same page with some terminology that pertains to firewood to kind of get off on the right foot. So first of all, we're going to review a little vocabulary. Number one, in the world of the movement of forest pests, we talk a lot about quarantines. And when you talk about quarantines in the forest pest context, they come in two different types that have two different names. There's external or internal quarantines, and sometimes those are called exterior or interior quarantines. Now, different pests have different types of quarantines that are applied to them. And sometimes a given pest might have all of the types of quarantines possible. And today is actually in tandem with National Invasive Species Awareness Week. It is also the Spotted Lanternfly Summit today, which is another webinar series. And so I thought it was very sort of appropriate to include a spotted lanternfly map for this slide. Spotted lanternfly has a number of interior quarantines. Those are the sort of red lines that outline the bright blue areas on this map. And that is the defined area by a state where materials that might be contaminated with spotted lanternfly in some way cannot leave those blue areas via those red lines. So those are interior quarantines. However, there are plenty of states that also have exterior or external quarantines pertaining to spotted lanternfly. The best example is California has a quarantine that says materials that could potentially be contaminated with spotted lanternfly. So very far away from where this map takes place, they have their own external quarantine. So both types of quarantines are really important in the management of forest pests, and both of them are highly relevant to the situation with firewood. Regulated items is also a term that I'm going to toss around quite a bit. A regulated item is basically anything that could transport a forest pest across a regulation boundary. Typically speaking, that would be across a quarantine. Those items cannot cross those quarantine boundaries without the appropriate treatment, inspection, or certification, depending on the situation. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about firewood as a regulated item, but for nearly every single pest, I believe every single pest that we will discuss, it is not the only regulated item. And in fact, for some particular types of pests that have what we sort of informally call a hitchhiker ecology, they often have regulated items that are almost everything that can be transported and is typically stored outside. So for instance, continuing the spotted lanternfly idea, somebody moving between states with a doghouse could potentially have a regulated doghouse. That would be a regulated item for the spotted lanternfly quarantine, or a houseplant. Houseplants are a big issue for quite a few forest pests that have a part of their life cycle that involves soil. So for instance, imported fire ant is a big issue with houseplants because they can form nests in the base of the pot. But we're not going to talk about dog houses and houseplants today. We're going to talk about firewood as a regulated item. Okay. Another piece of terminology that's really important for everybody to know is that the name change process for Lymantria dispar is almost complete. And the name put forward as a proposal to the Entomological Society of America was spongy moth. Now that name comes from the French language, so both France and Quebec uses it. And I'm going to do my very best to start practicing using it during the course of this presentation. I've been calling Lymantria dispar the prior name, which is an ethnic slur, for pushing 35 to 40 years because I grew up in New York State, where it is a very common pest. However, I can change, and I'm sure all of you can too, so I'm going to do my best to keep calling it spongy moth. If I trip up, please forgive me. So let's talk about firewood regulations now. One important detail to know is that a lot of firewood regulations, somewhat ironically, don't actually regulate firewood itself like that. They actually regulate the pest or the distance moved of firewood or a space. So when we talk about firewood regulations, we're actually talking about firewood relevant regulations that apply to firewood. And you can move those into a couple different broad categories to kind of sort them out in your head as to how they work. There's spatially drawn regulations, like the ones that we were just looking at for spotted lanternfly, where they're, the boundaries of those are geopolitical in some way. In the case of spotted lanternfly, it's states and counties. There's distance from origin regulations. These are less common, but they're very important because they're actually very scientifically valid. We know exactly why these could work if they were properly adhered to. New York State has a distance from origin regulation that we'll talk about. And then there's pest-driven regulations. So basically, whether or not an area has a pest is what drives. An area has a pest, or whether or not an area wants to prevent a pest drives the legal language of the regulation itself. And in those cases, firewood is just one regulated item. So we're wrapping all the terminology together before we get deep into the report here. Sorry, I keep having a pause. It's something about my computer. There we go. So across the United States, the new report that just came out yesterday, we attempted to visualize the data of the tremendous variation of firewood relevant statewide exterior or external rules and regulations that pertain to firewood. And this particular map shows you exactly how non-consistent across geographies state-based external rules and regulations are. So I'll take you through it real quick. The 7 states that are in brick color regulate the entry of all species of trees that form out of state firewood. So pine firewood, hardwood firewood, doesn't matter. All of those states also have some or extensive exemptions according to heat treatment and so forth, but you have to have an exemption or a certification or a heat treatment stamp or something to bring out of state firewood into those states. 4 additional states are planning to take the same action within the sort of near future. State regulations near future can range quite a bit. So I don't want to say in 2022, because sometimes these things take more than 1 year, but they are actively planning in the near future. 3 states that are kind of the sunshiny yellow regulate the entry of some, but not all species or categories of firewood itself from out of state. These are similar in many ways to the all out of state firewood quarantines, but they are constructed quite a bit differently. 27 states do not have all firewood or most firewood quarantines, but instead they have very specific pest-based quarantines that include firewood as a regulated item. And so you can see that's actually the most common category here. So only certain types of firewood, often only from certain areas, are excluded from entering the state in commercial or personal use. There's 2 states that actually are planning to rescind the applicable pest-based quarantines in so they will have no firewood quarantine moving forward in the somewhat near future. There are 13 states that have no state-based external regulation at all. Those states do not have a current system to prevent the movement of potentially contaminated firewood into their state that is sort of on the books. So they could take an emergency action in theory, but there's nothing currently on the books. Now, I also want to just take a moment to say that the people who put this report together, me and my employee, Laurel Downs, we are human beings, and this is a tremendously complicated topic. And so if you see an error in here and you know that this is wrong for some reason, you work for a state agency and you're like, oh my goodness, this is incorrect for my state, I would actually be delighted if you could let me know either in the Q&A or the chat or a private email. We would love to make sure this is as accurate as possible. So in those pest-driven regulations, that sort of light butter yellow, there are both pests of concern that are federally regulated, such as Asian longhorn beetle, Phytophthora remora, which is sudden oak death, etc., as well as pests of concern that are not federally regulated. So mountain pine beetle, which is a native forest pest of western forests, has an exterior quarantine held by the state of Minnesota. There are very specific small region pests that only affect one particular place that are very important. So that would be like Rapidohea death, which only currently affects some of the Hawaiian Islands. There's spotted lanternfly, which is an increasing issue, but that is not currently federally regulated, but rather it is regulated through a series of various state regulations. And then there's some pests that are just particularly challenging to sort of wrap your head around that have or do not have any pest-driven regulations. So for instance, laurel wilt and shot hole borers. So these pests sometimes don't get the regulations that one might think they deserve. And these pests kind of serve as a really good example as to why the idea of regulating all firewood from all species has validity beyond the idea of just regulating pest by pest. But firewood as a way to move forest pests in general is problematic enough that perhaps those regulations provide much better protection for the forests and trees of the states. So in order to break down all the different categories in our report, we really attempted to make sure we understood what exactly happens on the ground for every single state. And it is really quite overwhelming, to be totally frank. But I'll take you through a couple examples of what we looked at. And I highly recommend everybody download the report and review it themselves. From the different types of states that have specific intrastate movement, there's one state, for instance, that has a regulation that specifically limits the movement of all firewood that is not heat treated to 50 miles. That is a regulation held by the state of New York. There's also two other states that have really distance relevant restrictions. So that's Illinois and Maine. Illinois has a proposed rule that is considering basically putting in a distance-based restriction. And then Maine has a proof of in-state movement restriction that is very similar. So there's not a lot of states. Of all 50 states and 5 different territories, there's only 3 that either are planning or implementing distance-based regulations. For state lands, there's quite a few, but also not a majority. There are 9 states that have a formal regulation or policy for the movement of firewood onto state parks or onto state lands. There's quite a few examples of those, obviously, with 9. And then Virginia has sort of a unique legal framework where I believe it's every single park could opt to put in place their own policy if they enact it. This one, unfortunately, I didn't have time to review it in detail prior to this webinar because of my time mix up, but it's not exactly the same as a standing state lands or parks regulation. So then there's states with specific pest-specific state-held quarantines. Thank you for Elizabeth. Everybody, if you want to download the report itself, the link is in the chat. So states with the pest-specific state-held quarantine where the intrastate firewood movement is regulated as 22 different states have some sort of regulation as to how you move firewood within the state. Now, in some cases, it's a very, very isolated situation. So for instance, perhaps one county is regulated for a particular pest and firewood simply from that county out anywhere else in the state should not be transported. Obviously, that's not a full state regulation, but it does pertain to the movement of firewood within a given state. So there's a wide range of situations within the 22 states that do have intrastate relevant firewood movement regulations. So let's take a quick look here at how this can play out. So for instance, if you take a look at spotted lanternfly, let's take a look at the state of Connecticut because it serves as a good example. Just want to underline, for every single example I provide in this webinar, I am not attempting to malign any given state. I am just trying to illustrate the variability in approaches. So let's look at Connecticut. The county of Fairfield, bottom left of Connecticut, is currently known to have an infestation of spotted lanternfly, but there is no red border providing a Connecticut state law internal quarantine area. In contrast, New Jersey, all but the farthest southeastern county, is currently known to have spotted lanternfly infestations, and the more densely infested areas, which are those that are bounded by red, do have a standing state-based internal state quarantine area that says you cannot move potentially infested materials from that interior piece of New Jersey out into either the potentially infested counties that are blue on the outside of the line that are lightly infested, or the one remaining county that does not have a existing infestation known. So there's different approaches by different states, and these provide intra-state rules or not for the movement of materials. Now let's take a quick look at the federal quarantines. Like I said, this report actually does not highlight federal rules and quarantines. However, they are so relevant that we had to include them in order to give proper context. So much like I just looked at the spotted lanternfly map and we saw that there is a diversity of different approaches that are coming into play in that region. For the different federal quarantines, we've got a number of different either full or partial movement regulations that apply. So I'll say out these acronyms for everybody. So for Asian longhorn beetle, there are 4 states that are partially under federal quarantine. That means that you can't move firewood from an Asian longhorn beetle quarantined area out of that region into the rest of the state or anywhere else. For imported fire ant, also called red imported fire ant, there are 14 states that are under federal quarantine, either partially or fully, including Puerto Rico. For spongy moth, there are 20 states that are either partially or fully under federal quarantine. Sudden oak death, also known as Phytophthora ramorum, 2 states. Giant African snail, also known as giant African land snail, has 1 state and 3 territories under either full or partial federal quarantine. So all of these have a federal rule that prohibits the outbound movement from the quarantined area to anywhere else because of those specific pests, and firewood is a regulated item reasonably within either the list of regulated items or the sort of other items that may carry qualification within regulated items. Now, we also found that, just so everybody could see exactly how many states and territories have no known firewood regulation whatsoever that pertains to the interior movement of firewood, 12 states and territories did fall underneath that category. I see there's 2 Q&A. I'm going to take a quick look, catch my breath. And I include a definition of what is firewood, and then somebody seconds that. I'll actually address that right away. There are many definitions of firewood. Firewood is not a cleanly defined product. The National Plant Board put out a firewood guidelines report approximately 2 years ago. You can find it on the nationalplantboard.com website, .org, excuse me. And it has an extensive section on example definitions of firewood. Depending on where you are located and how you believe the firewood industry works in your area, different definitions may actually apply better or worse. So you cannot simply define firewood like all inclusively. It's not as easy as it sounds. I will put a link to, thank you. Elizabeth Barnes has put the link to the National Plant Board site. Elizabeth, if you could also put a link specifically to the firewood tab, that has a different website address, and you should be able to find it pretty easily. All right, I'll continue. So let's just take a quick look at sudden oak death's federal quarantined area. This map, I believe, was accurate last year. It was the most current PDF version I could find. And what it shows is that you have this large swath of coastal Northern California, as well as one area in Oregon that is under federal quarantine for sudden oak death. So firewood originating in the northwestern part of California cannot move into the rest of California, or in theory, the rest of the country in order to prevent the further dispersal of sudden oak death pathogen. Likewise, when we look at imported fire ant, this is a difficult one because imported fire ant is, well, first of all, just let's say imported fire ant bites. And so a lot of the times I get some pushback on this one. They're like, this is insane. Why would anybody move imported fire ant contaminated materials? And the answer is it's not that simple. We can't oversimplify the world that far. If you had, for instance, a pallet of packed firewood that had been stored on just plain dirt out in the environment in a yard, you know, it is entirely possible that that firewood would indeed be contaminated. And anything stored in direct contact with bare soil in the imported fire ant quarantine area absolutely should fall underneath the regulated items category. And so all the firewood from all of these affected bright pink counties, as well as the islands of Puerto Rico, is under the imported fire ant federal quarantine, and a reasonable reading of that quarantine includes any firewood that moves out of those regions. Also, I will note in the farther north areas of the imported fire ant quarantine area, it gets cold at night. And so the argument that they would come out and bite you, which I love, gets a little bit easier to understand that maybe that's not the case if you, you know, if it was winter or very early morning. So we can't just exclude imported fire ant because picking up an ant-infested piece of firewood is a terrible idea. There are many situations in which this could be a regulated item and could be problematic. So let's take a quick look at how we counteract this for the purposes of facilitating private industry and interstate trade. And that is state-based firewood heat treatment certifications. It's very important to make sure that small firewood producers, as well as large regional firewood producers, have tools to safely conduct their business under these conditions. And in order to do so, the most common exemption to all of the quarantines that I was talking about on the prior map that looked like this, but was sort of reddish and orangish and yellowish colors, is to heat treat it. There are 3 different types of heat treatment certification that are commonly used. You can think of them as low, medium, and high if you want. All of them have use and are practical for what they are sort of lined out in the heat treatment manual. But of course, the highest one does provide the highest level of protection against things like deep wood boring beetles. And the lower ones provide lower protection, but are still effective towards the pests that they are meant to address. And you can look that up in the manual. So right now, with the little more than 1 year anniversary of the complete deregulation of emerald ash borer, and that's why I'm here on Emerald Ash Borer University, so shout out to that insect. A lot of the states that used to manage their heat treatment program as part of the federal emerald ash borer quarantine area no longer have that same legal authority afforded to them from the federal quarantine, because the federal quarantine does not exist anymore for that particular pest. So some states have made an active transition to a state-based federal heat treatment certification program using the legal tools available to them by their state Department of Agriculture, typically speaking. Those states joined some states that never had a emerald ash borer federal quarantine and instead have always stood up their own firewood certification program, or states that never had the emerald ash borer federal quarantine ability to certify firewood and instead just went ahead and made sure they had a program to facilitate, interstate movement and to support small businesses and the forestry industry. So if you take a look at this map, you will see that the dark green states are the states that have a firewood certification program in place, so they can certify firewood as heat treated to a given standard. Or when the Joint Wing Firewood staff reached out to them, they said, absolutely, we have that ability if we have a firewood producer that requests it and has the facilities, but we don't currently have a firewood producer who's requesting it. That is just as valid, because if they do not have demand for a program, but they have capability and infrastructure in place, we counted it just the same. We're not here to judge whether or not they're doing it, just whether or not they could. Now, 3 states are still working on getting those programs stood up. So you can see here, Louisiana, Illinois, and Michigan, they're still working on making sure that their program is ready to take on firewood producers and certify their firewood. And I don't have a timeline for those 3 states, but then knowing that those states have it planned shows you that soon there will be more than, well more than half of the states will be able to certify firewood. At this time, 19 states have no ability or no current intent when we asked them to develop a state-based heat treatment certification program. So they either have no legal capability as far as they can tell due to the particulars of their state agency structures, or they do have a capability, but they have not begun to develop a program and they don't really have an intent to develop a program right now. There's an important caveat is that we're still working out the exact details on California's status here. My apologies, but it's just a little bit difficult to understand what their state-based firewood heat treatment certification program looks like. So a further new editions of this map actually might turn that to dark green. That remains to be seen. We also have not yet been able to get firm statuses from American Samoa, Guam, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico. Those are situations that we have not yet figured out because they do have the presence of several forest pests that are problematic. They may indeed have the capability, but no producers, in which case we would potentially turn them dark green as well, according to the iconography of this map. But we haven't figured that out yet. Now, a special note, during the course of the research and correspondence for this entire report, we did find an interesting phenomenon, which is that at this time, state officials who are very interested in firewood certification often somewhat spontaneously just mentioned, we do, but it's a difficult program and we wish there was a third-party certification option that we could work with instead. Or some of the state plant regulatory officials said, well, we don't have a program because it's really not going to work for our state, just given whatever structures and legal boundaries they have. And so we really wish there was a third-party certification program. So after that happened several times, we decided to do a little census of how many times that had come up in conversation. And it was 7 different state plant regulatory officials spontaneously expressed interest in a third-party certification option. And we never asked anybody about it. So I wonder if there is actually more interest in that option than you would know, because that was only the people who just volunteered the information as we were emailing with them. And I thought that was something worth noting in the report because it does suggest some future options for some of these states that have no ability to stand up a firewood heat treatment certification program, or they have no intent, which in some ways is not doing the most services that they could to the forestry industries of their state. So for instance, if they have no intent of standing up a program, then for all of those states that you saw in one of the prior maps that have either the brick color or the sunshine yellow color, it would be very difficult to have a regional firewood distribution network in that area if you don't have the ability to heat treat your firewood. So in the end, the Don't Move Firewood campaign, which I manage, is not focused entirely on the regulatory environment because regulations must be understood by both the public and the firewood producer in order to actually work. And so one of the most important things that we did with this report is we took all of this tremendous amount of information on the different types of quarantines, regulations, and so forth, and we tried to make it into a coherent framework to evaluate the online public outreach visibility of whatever a state has. So even if a state only has a recommendation, is that recommendation well communicated? If the state does have extensive regulations, are those regulations currently available to the public in some way? We used 4 different metrics to evaluate the online public outreach visibility of anything for any state. And that was whether or not, number 1, we could find it in either a high visibility, low visibility, or 0 finding for state agency firewood communications. Now, state agency is a little bit of a tricky one because some states have multiple applicable agencies. So for instance, you might have both the Department of Agriculture and a completely separate Department of Natural Resources. Those are lumped in this. So any one or more state agency that has good firewood communications, either high or low visibility, would count. Then also, we looked at cooperative extension. The goals of cooperative extension are outreach and education. And so we wanted to see, does cooperative extension have good firewood communications that are highly visible, or do they have limited visibility communications. So for instance, only in a pest alert. So you'd have to know to look in a pest alert. It wouldn't come obviously, or no cooperative extension firewood communication. Then one of the most common users of firewood, as I think we can all appreciate, is campers. So we looked at if a state parks or lands, depending on the way that they divide up camping in the state agency structure of a given state. Do the state parks or lands have online camping related communications pertaining to the movement of firewood? And then relatedly, if you try to make a reservation, oftentimes those reservation processes are third party. And so if you try to make a reservation, will you encounter firewood movement regulations at some point anywhere in the campground reservation process? And in order to assess that last one, we picked 3 representative state parks. I mean, you can't call it randomly because we didn't use like a random number generator, but somewhat arbitrarily. One in the north or west part of a state, one in the central part of a state, and one in the southeast. So 3 points of data for every state spread out so that we could at least have some representation. And then we made a graph. And here it is. So what you can see is that state agencies have a tremendous amount of high visibility firewood outreach information available to the public. So I forgot to write down the numbers, but I think it's 42, maybe it's 43. And then you've got that have high visibility. A few of them have low visibility sites and very few have a not found rating. So very few states have no leading state agency, Department of Agriculture, Department of Natural Resources, whatever, that provides this information. Cooperative extension was a little different. What we saw was that 10 states had high visibility firewood information, but then fully 30 of them only had it within lower visibility sites, such as pest alerts that are very specific to an audience as opposed to being a general educational site. And then 10 had none at all, as the best that we could find. State parks had basically the opposite distribution of data from cooperative extension. So state parks had pretty strong showing on high visibility. Very few had low visibility information. It was more of an all or nothing distribution because unfortunately we saw that something like 17 state parks had absolutely no information on firewood movement whatsoever. Now it's important to say that we had an extraordinarily low bar to assess these and create these comparisons. So essentially, if it said don't move firewood, or if it said buy firewood where you burn it, or if it said please don't bring out of state firewood, it didn't have to have any state law or any regulation to support it. It was basically just, is any information present? And that would get you a low visibility rating. If good information was present, you get a high visibility rating. And then last but not least, we were pretty disappointed to see that the situation in state parks reservations, third-party sites, was actually worse than the situation in state parks general information sites. That's disappointing because I would hope actually, in theory, that state parks reservation sites, because they have comprehensive listings of policies in general, I mean, no dog barking, no partying after 10 p.m. Like they're a place where rules are found. And unfortunately, not enough of the rules are found for the movement of firewood. So that's a point necessary for improvement for a lot of states. And that is a point where the public is going to look for, what are the rules? What are the recommendations? Can I bring my dog? That's going to be where people will be like, oh, I'm not supposed to bring firewood either. And so that point, that touch point for people is really important. So we were disappointed to see that result. But that is the intention of this report, is to highlight these gaps to allow states to correct gaps and actually improve the larger firewood information sort of ecosystem that the public encounters as they make decisions. So looking forward, this webinar will be recorded and available soon, like Elizabeth and Robin indicated at the beginning of the webinar. I will be giving another identical webinar this Friday for National Invasive Species Awareness Week. If you would like to attend that one or you want to tell a colleague about it, I really intend for it to be almost entirely identical, hopefully not with the slightly rocky technology start. So if you watch this one, please don't feel like you need to watch the second one, but definitely recommend it to anybody who you think would benefit from it. I will be working with my employee to create the individual state and territorial appendices of this report frantically over the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks. We have them all written, but they are all being fact checked and discussed. And then any revisions that we need to make from the first 2 webinars that we actually find errors or mistakes or misstatements, any significant feedback, we will be including that into version 2. And we have a goal to release version 2 on the 18th of March. Completely separately from the Firewood comparison report, Don't Move Firewood also maintains public, state, and provincial summaries that will continue. Oh, sorry, there's a typo in this line. They will continue to be present and they do not follow the formats seen in this report because they have an utterly different audience. So the audience of this report and this webinar is for forest health professionals of some sort, whether you're a volunteer or a federal employee, it doesn't matter. At some level, you have professional training and an interest in learning more from that perspective. That's why you're on this webinar, and that's why we wrote that report. That's completely different from what the Don't Move Firewood map is. The Don't Move Firewood map is for everybody. It is a public outreach document. It is written in layperson terminology. It definitely doesn't get into things like treatment levels for firewood and non-harmonization of regulations or anything like that. So I just wanted to make that distinction extremely clear because different documents have different audiences, and the Firewood comparison report is a professional audience. All right, last but not least, I leave with one of my very favorite anecdotes, which is when I visited the Big Island of Hawaii for a work conference quite a few years ago. The first piece of firewood for sale that I found was from Estonia, the country in Europe, and it had been heat treated to a very high standard. So it was not a forest pest concern, but it was an absolutely fascinating commentary on the global supply chain. So firewood comes in many different shapes and sizes. And I think one of the things that really comes out in this Firewood comparisons report is that the regulations and the certifications are so variable that it is a very difficult universe to wrap your head around. How firewood from Estonia or Latvia reaches the Big Island of Hawaii is a really fascinating question. So thank you to all of our partners throughout North America for helping us with this report and more. And special thanks to USDA APHIS, which funds both the Don't Move Firewood outreach campaign and the Firewood Outreach Coordinating Initiative. Special thanks to my employee who is currently not in the office this week for some personal leave, Laurel Downs, for leading the research and writing of the Firewood comparison report. We've got 12 minutes for questions, which is great. It's about what I was hoping for. And I welcome anybody who would like me to flip back to another slide to look at a map or a chart.
All right, thank you, Leigh. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A or the chat. I'm keeping track of both of those. Let's see. I don't see any yet. I'm going to give people a minute to type. Here we go. Thanks for sharing your report. It is complete and thorough. Outstanding job on framing this complex and convoluted topic. Way to go. What are some next steps?
That's such a great question. So, well, let me start with what I think is really a point that I want to get across, which is because I also run the Don't Move Firewood campaign, which is, as I said, a public education and outreach campaign. This chart shows where we can do better. And we can do better without passing complicated regulations or rules or orders, which some states are not going to do for either economic, political, whatever reason. Recommendation, every single one of these, in my opinion, of these 4 entities could have a 50-state green bar. These are outreach topics, they are not regulations. So for instance, every single state parks entity could have a statement that says, we prefer local firewood. We think it would be better if you moved firewood shorter distance rather than longer distances. These can be very general statements. Sometimes that's just enough to nudge the public into doing the right thing. So I would say some of the next steps is that if you have any type of professional connections or leverage with any of these types of entities, you can go look on the Firewood report, which is linked above. Elizabeth put it in, and take a look at the state-by-state breakdown of the chart and see how your state performed on each of them. And if they received an orange or a red rating on just one or two of them, you could reach out to those state entities and say, hey, you know, it's disappointing to me that the cooperative extension website doesn't have a dedicated Firewood education page. You know, you have an emerald ash borer pest alert and you have a spotted lanternfly pest alert, and that's important. But you should also just have a Firewood one that would help people learn about the topic. So that's one of the most important and most doable next steps. Some of the other next steps are much more challenging. So for instance, when we look at state-based firewood heat treatment certification, I think it would be good to fill this map in with more states that were facilitating safe firewood in regional firewood distribution and production networks. I think it would be better to have more state-based firewood heat treatment facilities and capabilities. And in order to do so, if it does come to pass that we get a third-party certification process, I think that could be one really good solution. But this is a very complicated topic and a very difficult one, much more so than it looks like. So it's a difficult next step to suggest. However, it definitely jumped out at us in the writing of the report. And so it is one really important to talk about.
Some really, really great points there. I absolutely agree. I don't see any other questions yet. I was wondering, it looks like you could pretty easily, you know, take, oh, wait, nope. Okay, never mind. I've got another question from a listener. I'm going to prioritize that. What are your thoughts on urban firewood movement or urban wood movement?
So when I see urban wood movement, what I believe that question is referring to is reutilization of dead trees in the urban environment. And I would say that just like anything, the devil is in the details. And when you reuse urban wood, sometimes those trees died because of not biologically important factors. So perhaps they weren't watered enough, or perhaps they were hit by a car, or perhaps they reached the end of their natural lifespan. In other cases, for instance, with emerald ash borer killed trees, sometimes they are still actively breeding emerald ash borer in the tree when it dies. And so you have this tremendous range of risk represented by urban wood. So my general thoughts on the urban wood movement, like across the United States, is that information on best practices is going to allow that sort of reuse and sort of revitalization of a dead tree into something that, you know, encourages the economy and art and, you know, the culture of the area. You have to make sure that they have best practices for mitigating any risk, especially with things like emerald ash borer that can actually remain viable in the wood for a fairly decent amount of time and often kills urban trees. So the short of it is that I think it's really important to come up with solutions to urban trees as they die that are creative and beneficial to the city, but also you must use best practices to mitigate risks from things like emerald ash borer.
All right, great. And the person who asked the question.
You're welcome. I'm glad that was helpful. But I will just say I am using emerald ash borer as an example multiple times in this presentation because it's a really important example. But it is by no means the only example for many of these pests and these scenarios and situations. And also with urban wood especially, we saw a lot of movement of thousand cankers disease of walnut in walnut trees because walnut wood itself is worth a good deal of money. It's a very high quality hardwood. It's very interesting. It grows in cool shapes. It's great for woodworking. So the issues of urban tree reuse absolutely extend to many, many species of trees and many species of pests associated with them. So I just wanted to make that clear. It's not just emerald ash borer, but it has been a big issue for emerald ash borer.
Great. Oh. Okay. I don't see any other questions for now. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to tell our listeners before we end, Leigh?
Thank you so much for listening, and please do tell your colleagues if you think they would benefit from this. It's basically same presentation but live on a different day to attend the presentation for National Invasive Species Awareness Week, which will be Friday morning instead of right now.
Great. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for everyone who's attended. And I have the report pulled up right now. I just started scrolling through it real quick and it looks great. I really recommend anyone who hasn't had a chance to read it should take a quick look and send it to anyone that's interested. Thank you again for attending Emerald Ash Borer University. You will be getting an email probably tomorrow with information on how you can get continuing education credits for watching this webinar. And that will also have contact information for our speaker. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to shoot us an email. Thank you and goodbye.